The Last Samurai. Chapter 1. The Last Rays of the Sun. The distant beat of drums broke the morning silence as the first rays of the sun began to pierce through the thick tree crowns. The dew-soaked earth reflected the golden light, creating the illusion of endless fields covered with a precious carpet. But behind this serene picture, a shadow of impending doom loomed. Katsuro Ishikawa stood on a hill, silent and pensive, staring at the horizon where nature and man prepared for an inevitable clash. His heart beat in unison with the earth, his breath a part of the great rhythm that had existed long before he was born. Ahead of him stretched a world that would soon be irreversibly changed. Katsuro was the last of the Ishikawa clan, an ancient samurai lineage with a history spanning over 1,000 years. His ancestors had served various daimyos, upholding the honor and dignity of their family by following the Bushido Code. But now, in 1868, these traditions were beginning to give way to a new, unknown era. The sounds of the drums gradually faded, giving way to the gentle rustling of the wind, carrying the scents of spring flowers and ashes. At the far end of the clearing, a rider appeared, guiding his horse toward Katsuro. It was Takashi Fujimura, a childhood friend who had become an officer in the new Imperial Army. As Takashi rode closer, his face reflected a mix of concern and determination. He dismounted slowly and approached Katsuro. "Japan is changing, my friend," Takashi said with a heavy sigh. "You know this is inevitable. The emperor is determined to reform the country, and the old order must give way to the new." Katsuro did not respond immediately. He slowly shifted his gaze from the horizon to his friend, looking deep into his eyes, which were full of sadness and doubt. "I know," he finally said quietly, "but what about our honor, our loyalty? How can we simply abandon everything we believed in our entire lives?" "We must adapt," Takashi replied, trying to speak calmly, though there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. "It's the only way to avoid destruction. I don't want to lose you, Katsuro." Katsuro nodded silently, but inside him a storm raged. He understood that the world had changed and that resistance might be futile. But his soul, deeply rooted in tradition, could not so easily accept this new reality. "Soon the battle will begin," Takashi continued, his voice growing more insistent. "You must choose a side, Katsuro. Who will you fight for?" Katsuro lowered his eyes to the ground, feeling his heart tighten with pain. Before him stood a choice: to follow his friend, supporting the new ideas, or to remain loyal to the old principles, even if it meant his demise. He knew what he would answer, but he was not yet ready to say it aloud. "I will make my decision when the time comes," he finally said, lifting his head and looking at his friend again. "For now, let's go. We must prepare for what lies ahead." They moved forward, step by step, toward the moment that would change their fates forever. Ahead lay a path filled with dangers and hardships, but Katsuro knew he had to walk it to the end, even if it would cost him everything. And the wind picked up, bringing with it the premonition of the coming storm. The last rays of the sun lit their path, but soon the sky would be covered with clouds, and night would fall. There was still much unknown ahead, but Katsuro was ready to face his destiny. Chapter 2. Time of Change. The city of Kyoto was bustling with life, immersed in the boiling atmosphere of reforms and revolutions. The streets were crowded with streams of people: artisans, merchants, ordinary townsfolk, and soldiers dressed in the new Imperial Army uniform. The sounds of rumbling carts and the cries of street vendors mingled with military music emanating from the central quarters where the new government organized its headquarters. Katsuro walked through the city's streets, observing this new world that was gradually taking over his country. His ancient Ishikawa clan had long upheld order and justice in their ancestral lands, but now he felt like a stranger among these noisy crowds. It seemed that old Kyoto, with its serene temples and shady gardens, had dissolved in the turmoil of modernization. At that moment, Katsuro remembered his father's words, spoken to him when Katsuro was still a boy. "A true samurai is one who can remain calm even amid chaos. You must be like water, flowing around rocks and always finding your way." But now, in this new Kyoto, it seemed that everything he had been taught had lost its meaning. Time was passing, and the country was changing too quickly, leaving no room for reflection or doubt. Katsuro stopped at the entrance to a temple that had once been a place of meditation and learning. Now it appeared abandoned and forgotten. On its steps sat a group of young samurai who, like him, looked lost in this new world. "Katsuro!" a voice called from behind him. He turned and saw Masako, his sister. She was dressed in a simple kimono, but even in this attire, her posture and manner revealed the nobility of the samurai lineage. In her eyes shone the determination that had not left her even in these difficult times. "Masako," he said softly as she approached, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I knew I would find you here," she replied with a slight smile. "This temple was important to our family, and I knew you would come here to seek answers." Katsuro sighed and nodded, acknowledging her truth. "Time marches relentlessly forward, Masako," he said, gazing at the deserted temple. "We can no longer live as our ancestors did. But how do I find my place in this new world?" "Traditions do not die, brother," Masako replied, placing a hand on his shoulder. "They live within us, in our hearts. What matters is not how we look or what we wear, but what we carry within. You must follow your path as our ancestors did. Even if the world has changed, your values remain the same." These words struck a chord in Katsuro's heart, reminding him that his duty was not just to preserve traditions, but to find a way to apply them in the new world. "You're right, Masako," he said, feeling a new resolve awaken within him. "We must adapt, but not abandon our honor. I will find a way to preserve our traditions in this new world." Masako nodded and smiled, sensing that her brother had regained his lost balance. "And now," she continued, "we must return home. We have important news." They left the temple, leaving the past behind, but with new hope for the future. Kyoto buzzed and roared, but Katsuro and Masako walked confidently through the crowd, like the wind cutting through the chaos. When they reached their ancestral home, they were met by Takashi, who was waiting for them in the garden. He looked serious and concerned. "We have a new mission," he said, looking directly into Katsuro's eyes. "This task could decide the outcome of the entire war." Katsuro felt the tension rising. He knew that something great and terrible awaited them, but he was ready to accept any challenge. "What is this mission?" he asked, gripping the hilt of his sword. "We must stop General Saito," Takashi replied. "He intends to destroy everything that remains of old Japan. We cannot let that happen." These words sounded like a challenge to fate. Katsuro understood that his actions would determine not only his fate, but the future of his entire people. And now he was ready to fight for that future, no matter the cost. Chapter 3. Friendship and Duty. Night had fallen over Kyoto, enveloping the city in silence and mystery. On the narrow streets, lanterns flickered, casting long shadows on the stone walls. Katsuro and Takashi walked side by side, their steps barely audible against the whisper of the wind. Both were deep in thought about the upcoming mission, which was becoming more and more clear as they approached their goal. The silence was broken by Takashi's voice. "I know this isn't easy for you, Katsuro, but we must be ready to do whatever it takes to stop Saito." Katsuro didn't respond immediately. He felt his heart tearing between friendship and duty. Takashi had been his loyal friend since childhood, but now they found themselves on opposite sides of the barricades. Saito, the man they were about to confront, was a symbol of the new Japan, a force determined to destroy everything sacred to Katsuro. "I understand, Takashi," Katsuro finally said, his voice quiet but resolute. "But what happens if we fail? If our efforts are in vain, and everything we fought for disappears?" Takashi stopped and looked at his friend with serious eyes. "I believe we can change the course of history," he replied. "We are the last ones who can make a difference, and if we don't try, we'll lose everything." These words echoed in Katsuro's heart. He had always believed that each person chooses their own destiny, but now he realized there were moments when there was no choice, when duty demanded sacrifice. "Have you ever wondered, Takashi, why we're here? Why we chose this path?" Katsuro suddenly asked. Takashi was silent for a moment before responding. We didn't choose this path, Katsuro. It was predetermined by our fate, our history. We are the product of our time, and each of us must play our role. But I believe that despite all the difficulties, we can preserve what is important to us." These words made Katsuro think. He had always believed that every person chooses their own destiny. But now he realized there were moments when there was no choice, when duty demanded sacrifice. "We must go all the way," he finally said, deciding to set aside his doubts. "Let this be our last battle, but we will do everything to win." Takashi nodded and they moved forward again. The night continued to envelop them, but now they walked with determination, knowing that a great battle awaited them. When they reached their base, they were met by Masako. She, as always, was calm and focused, but her eyes revealed tension. "General Saito is already preparing his army," she said without wasting time. "We must act quickly. We have only one chance to strike." Katsuro and Takashi exchanged glances. They knew Masako was right. Time was not on their side, and any delay could lead to disaster. "We're ready," Katsuro replied, firmly gripping the hilt of his sword. "Let's begin." The night slowly gave way to dawn as they set off. Their goal was clear. They had to infiltrate General Saito's camp and stop him before he struck the last defenders of old Japan. As they approached the camp, they were met with the sight of lights flickering in the darkness. Hundreds of soldiers were preparing for battle, but at the center of it all stood the man who was the embodiment of destruction for Katsuro, General Saito. Katsuro froze for a moment, staring at his enemy. He knew this battle would be the hardest of his life, but he also knew that it was the only way to preserve what was dear to his heart. "This is our chance," Takashi whispered, leaning close. "We must do it now." Katsuro nodded and they moved forward, swords in hand. Ahead of them lay a fight that would determine their fates and the fate of the entire country. Chapter 4: Winds of War. Dawn painted the skies with crimson and golden hues, heralding a day that would change the fate of all Japan. Katsuro, Takashi, and Masako hid in the shadows of the forest, watching General Saito's camp come to life with the first rays of the sun. Soldiers, like ants, scurried about, preparing for the attack. Hundreds of people, absorbed in their duties, seemed like small parts of a vast painting of impending catastrophe. Katsuro gripped the hilt of his katana, feeling the cold metal in his palm. His thoughts were focused, but deep down he knew the upcoming battle would be far from easy. Saito was not just an enemy. He represented a new era, encroaching on the old world to which Katsuro belonged with all his heart. "We must act quickly," Takashi whispered, not taking his eyes off the camp. "If we don't stop him now, the whole country will fall under the onslaught of his army." Masako nodded, confirming the group's resolve. "Our target is the command tent," she said quietly, pointing to the center of the camp, where a large tent, surrounded by guards, stood. "If we can infiltrate and eliminate the command, the army will lose coordination." Katsuro glanced at Masako and Takashi, trying to memorize their faces before they split up for the mission. He felt the weight of the moment, knowing that any of them might not return. But this was part of their duty, their destiny. "We'll proceed according to plan," he said, trying to hide his emotions. "I'll go through the north entrance, Takashi through the south. Masako, you'll stay close to the center and cover us. Once we're inside, we'll attack the command from both sides." Everyone nodded in agreement, and each took their position. As they approached the camp, their cover became unreliable. They had to move faster, avoiding patrols and quietly taking out those who crossed their path. Katsuro moved silently, like a shadow, his sword an extension of his arm, gleaming in the morning light. He felt adrenaline coursing through his body, but he also knew this might be his last battle. When he reached the north entrance, he saw 2 guards standing watch. Their attention was scattered, giving Katsuro an opportunity to strike. He rushed forward, darting out from behind cover, and with lightning precision, struck both guards before they could cry out. Their bodies fell silently to the ground, and Katsuro continued toward the command tent. Meanwhile, Takashi was making his way through the south entrance. His movements were just as swift and precise. He understood that their success depended on speed and surprise. As he approached the tent, he could already see Masako approaching from the other side. Finally, they reached the command tent. Inside, voices could be heard. General Saito was discussing the final preparations with his officers. At that moment, time seemed to slow. Katsuro and Takashi exchanged glances, knowing the decisive moment had arrived. Katsuro took a deep breath and forcefully pulled back the tent flap. In an instant, he burst inside, with Takashi following closely. Inside the tent were 5 officers, including General Saito. Their faces reflected shock and surprise, but they quickly regained their composure. "What are you doing here?" Saito shouted, drawing his sword. Katsuro did not respond. Instead, he lunged at the general, their blades clashing with a thunderous clang that echoed through the tent. A fierce battle ensued. Takashi engaged the remaining officers, his sword flashing through the air like lightning. He knew their chances were slim, but there was no turning back. Every strike could be his last. Masako held her position at the entrance, cutting down anyone who tried to enter. Her movements were fluid and deadly, like a tigress defending her territory. Katsuro fought Saito, their duel a collision of 2 eras. Swords whistled through the air, clashing with sparks, and the eyes of the opponents reflected unwavering determination. Katsuro knew his enemy was strong and experienced, but he could not afford to lose. "You fight for a past that can never return," Saito shouted, blocking another of Katsuro's strikes. "I fight for honor and justice," Katsuro replied, delivering a powerful blow that forced Saito to step back. The fight continued, but Katsuro felt his strength gradually waning. Suddenly, he noticed one of the officers aiming his weapon at Takashi, who was unable to react in time. Katsuro leapt toward his friend, saving him from the fatal blow, but it cost him his own defense. Saito seized the moment and delivered a strong strike that pierced Katsuro's shoulder. Pain shot through him, but he did not fall. He continued to fight despite the wound. At that moment, Masako managed to take down the last of the officers, leaving Saito alone with the 2 samurai. Takashi joined Katsuro, and now they surrounded the general. "Your reign has come to an end," Takashi said, pointing his sword at Saito. Saito smirked, knowing his chances of victory were slim, but he was not about to surrender. "Perhaps," he said, "but my death will change nothing. Japan has already chosen its path." With these words, he charged at them with a final desperate cry. Katsuro and Takashi delivered the finishing blows simultaneously, and Saito fell at their feet. The tent filled with silence. Katsuro, breathing heavily, looked down at the general's body. He knew it was a victory, but it brought him no joy. The battlefield was littered with the bodies of those who had fought and died for their ideals. Among the fallen, he saw his comrades, his sister Masako, lying among other warriors who had given their lives to ensure the old traditions were not forgotten. Takashi, gravely wounded, approached Katsuro, his face covered in blood and dust. "We did it, my friend," he said, leaning on his sword to stay upright. "But at what cost?" Katsuro looked at his friend and slowly nodded. There was sadness in his eyes, but also an understanding that their struggle had not been in vain. They had fought not just for the past, but for the future, so that the next generations would remember what honor, duty, and loyalty meant. "At the cost we were willing to pay," Katsuro replied quietly. "But this is not the end. We must continue to live and pass on our values to those who come after us. Even if our world is fading, its spirit will remain alive." Takashi nodded, knowing that Katsuro's words carried a deep truth. They had survived to carry their story forward, so that no one would forget what they had done and what they had fought for. As the sun rose over the horizon, illuminating the battlefield with its first rays, Katsuro and Takashi, leaning on each other, left the place where their fates had intertwined with those of so many others. They walked slowly, knowing that many trials still lay ahead, but aware that they were ready to face them with dignity. The sunset of the samurai era had come, but in their hearts lived the light they carried with them as they continued on their path in a new changed world. Chapter 5. A Deadly Battle. After the victory over General Saito, Katsuro, Takashi, and Masako left the camp under the cover of night, not lingering to celebrate their triumph. They knew that new challenges awaited them, and every minute was precious. They needed to find shelter, recover their strength, and prepare for the next stage of their mission. Early in the morning, they reached an abandoned temple in the mountains, which had once served as a refuge for monks. Now its halls were empty, and it became the perfect place to rest and reflect on what had happened. Katsuro, despite the pain in his wounded shoulder, remained in good spirits, but anxiety gnawed at his heart. He felt that the main battle was yet to come. The temple was enveloped in a grave silence, broken only by the whisper of the wind seeping through the cracks in the walls. Katsuro sat at the entrance, his sword resting on his knees and his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. Inside him, a struggle raged. On the one hand, he felt satisfaction from defeating Saito, but on the other, doubt plagued him. How could they continue to resist? Masako quietly approached her brother, noticing his tense state. "You're thinking too much, Katsuro," she said, sitting down beside him. "We won, and that's what matters. We've proven that we can still fight." Katsuro nodded, but he couldn't hide the concern in his eyes. "I know, Masako," he replied, "but I'm afraid this is only the beginning. Saito was just a part of a bigger plan. The Emperor and his army won't stop until they've destroyed everything connected to our old Japan. We won the battle, but the war continues, and I'm not sure we're ready for what's coming." Masako looked at her brother with determination. "We are always ready, Katsuro. This is our destiny, and we must fulfill it to the end. We're fighting not just for ourselves, but for everyone who believes in our values. Don't forget that." At that moment, Takashi approached them, his face serious but his eyes showing understanding. "Masako is right," he said, joining the conversation. "We must continue moving forward despite all the difficulties. I've learned that a new general, Nagato Hashimoto, is already gathering an army to crush anyone who opposes the reforms. He will be more ruthless and merciless than Saito." Katsuro frowned, realizing that their enemy was becoming increasingly dangerous. Hashimoto was known for his bloodthirstiness and for sparing no one in his path. Facing him would mean a deadly battle. "We must stop him," Katsuro said resolutely. "But how? There are only 3 of us, and we have no army or resources." Takashi smiled, his confidence contagious. "We are not alone, Katsuro. There are still people who are loyal to the old traditions. We can find allies, gather troops from those who want to fight for their future. It won't be easy, but we have a chance." Masako nodded in agreement. "Time is on our side if we act quickly. I know of several loyal samurai who can join us. We must move now while we still have the opportunity." Katsuro felt a new hope stirring in his soul. Although he knew they were facing a dangerous path, he also understood that they had a chance to change the future. They couldn't afford to lose. "We'll do it," he said, standing up. "We'll gather everyone who is ready to fight for our Japan, and we will stand to the end." Takashi and Masako stood beside him, their eyes shining with determination. They knew that a deadly battle awaited them, but they were ready to face it with honor. Over the next few days, they traveled through villages and towns, seeking allies. At every step, they found those who were willing to stand by them, who believed that the old traditions must be preserved. Their small group gradually grew into a band of dedicated warriors ready to fight for their country. When they finally approached the mountain pass where their final battle was to take place, they were met by General Hashimoto's army. Thousands of soldiers, armed with the latest Western technology, stood against a small but determined band of samurai. It was a clash of 2 worlds, old and new, tradition and progress. Katsuro, standing at the front, felt the full weight of the moment. He knew this battle would be decisive. He drew his sword, and his warriors followed suit. Death was near, but they marched toward it with open eyes and hearts full of honor. "Today we fight for our Japan," Katsuro shouted, his voice echoing through the mountains. "For our honor, for our traditions, for Japan!" A chorus of voices responded, and they charged into the attack. Battle was fierce. The samurai fought with incredible strength and determination, despite the enemy's numerical superiority. Each of them knew this would be their last battle, and so they gave their all. Katsuro fought as if every blow was his last. His sword struck down enemies without rest, but his strength was gradually leaving him. He saw his comrades fall one by one under the enemy's blows, but none of them retreated. In the midst of the battle, Katsuro found himself facing General Hashimoto. Their eyes met, and in that moment, They knew their fates were intertwined forever. "You are nothing compared to the new forces I represent," Hashimoto said coldly, pointing his sword at Katsuro. "Perhaps," Katsuro replied, gripping the hilt of his katana. "But I fight not for power. I fight for honor and for a future we can preserve." And they clashed in a duel that would determine not only their fates, but the fate of the entire country. Chapter 6. The Sunset of the Samurai. The duel between Katsuro and General Hashimoto was a symbol of the collision of two eras, two different worldviews. Their swords, glinting in the rising sun, met with the force each believed to be their only truth. Swift strikes, accompanied by the sharp clang of steel, echoed across the battlefield, where only the most resilient warriors remained. Katsuro felt his body struggling to withstand each new collision. The wound he had received in the battle with Saito reminded him of its presence with every movement, but he did not let the pain overpower him. Every strike he delivered was filled with a deep resolve to protect what he held sacred. His sword, which had struck down many enemies, was now aimed at the man who embodied the destruction of the old world. "Your efforts are in vain, Katsuro," Hashimoto said, stepping back to catch his breath. "The new world has already arrived. You cannot stop progress. The time of the samurai has passed." "The time of the samurai may pass," Katsuro replied, his voice quiet but full of inner strength. "But the spirit by which they lived will remain. I am ready to accept the end of my era, but I will not betray those who believed in me and my ideals." With these words, Katsuro took a decisive step forward, putting all his remaining strength into a final strike. His katana flashed through the air, cutting through the mist as if guided by fate itself. But Hashimoto was ready. He parried the strike with cold precision, and the blades met with a fierce clash of sparks. In that moment, the world seemed to freeze, and Katsuro felt his body losing strength. But he did not allow himself to fall. Even weakened, he did not surrender, and this gave him a crucial advantage. Resigned to the inevitable, Hashimoto made a mistake. He lunged forward, hoping to crush his opponent with one powerful blow. But Katsuro, anticipating this move, dodged and directed his sword into the gap in the enemy's defense. In an instant, it was over. Hashimoto collapsed to the ground, struck in the heart. His sword fell with a clang beside him, and he lay still, as if a symbol of a bygone era buried under the weight of its own ambitions. Katsuro stood, breathing heavily, feeling the blood pounding in his temples. He had won, but the victory brought him no joy. The battlefield was strewn with the bodies of those who had fought and died for their ideals. Among the fallen, he saw his comrades, his sister Masako, lying among other warriors who had given their lives to ensure that the old traditions would not be forgotten. Takashi, gravely wounded, approached Katsuro, his face covered in blood and dust. "We did it, my friend," he said, leaning on his sword to stay upright. "But at what cost?" Katsuro looked at his friend and slowly nodded. There was sadness in his eyes, but also an understanding that their struggle had not been in vain. They had fought not just for the past, but for the future, so that the next generations would remember what honor, duty, and loyalty meant. "At the cost we were willing to pay," Katsuro replied quietly. "But this is not the end. We must continue to live and pass on our values to those who come after us. Even if our world is fading, its spirit will remain alive." Takashi nodded, knowing that Katsuro's words carried a deep truth. They had survived to carry their story forward so that no one would forget what they had done and what they had fought for. As the sun rose over the horizon, illuminating the battlefield with its first rays, Katsuro and Takashi, leaning on each other, left the place where their fates had intertwined with those of so many others. They walked slowly, knowing that many trials still lay ahead, but aware that they were ready to face them with dignity. The sunset of the samurai era had come, but in their hearts lived the light they carried with them as they continued on their path in a new changed world. Chapter 7. A New Beginning. Months had passed since the last battle at the mountain pass. The winds of change continued to blow over Japan, sweeping through its hills and valleys, bringing new orders and forgetting old traditions. But among these storms were those who preserved the memory of the past and continued to carry the light of their time. Katsuro and Takashi, despite their wounds and losses, returned to Kyoto. The city was almost unrecognizable. New buildings and bridges, wide roads and foreign merchants had become part of its landscape. But amidst all this remained islands of the old, the ancient temples, narrow streets, and old houses that continued to hold the spirit of the past. Katsuro watched with both sadness and pride as the changes unfolded in his homeland. He understood that time moved inexorably forward, and nothing could stop it. But he also knew that what he had fought for had not disappeared. On the contrary, it had been reborn in the hearts of those who saw in him not just a relic of the past, but a foundation for a new future. Takashi, despite the wounds that could have confined him to bed, continued to lead an active life. He became a teacher for the youth, passing on his knowledge of samurai arts and philosophy to those who wished to learn. His school, established on the outskirts of Kyoto, became a place where tradition and modernization met and found common ground. "I'm glad we can continue the work of our ancestors," Takashi said one evening, as he and Katsuro sat on the veranda of his house, watching the sunset. "Despite all the changes, we can preserve what matters most, the spirit of the samurai." Katsuro smiled, looking at the horizon behind which the sun was setting. "Yes, Takashi," he replied. "We did everything we could. We preserved our honor, and that's the most important thing. Now it's time to pass on our knowledge and our spirit to the next generations." The young students of Takashi, sitting nearby, listened to their conversation with respect and attention. Each of them knew they were participating in the creation of a new Japan, where the old and the new could coexist. They sought to learn, to absorb the wisdom of the past, and use it to build the future. As for Katsuro, after years of war and struggle, he found his place in the new world. He was no longer a warrior fighting on the battlefield, but he remained a guardian of tradition. Alongside Takashi, he passed on his knowledge, teaching the youth about honor, dignity, and humility. One of these young students was a boy named Hiroto. He had lost his parents in the final battles and found refuge in Takashi's school. Hiroto became something of a symbol of the new Japan for Katsuro and Takashi, a country that had endured much but was striving for recovery and prosperity. One day, as Katsuro was teaching Hiroto the basics of swordsmanship, he felt that this boy had the potential to become a great warrior, but not the kind Katsuro himself had been. Hiroto was the embodiment of a new era, a new generation that could harmoniously combine tradition and modernity. "Teacher Katsuro," Hiroto asked one day as they sat under a cherry tree, "how can I preserve the spirit of the samurai in a world that is changing so quickly?" Katsuro looked at the boy with warmth and wisdom gained over many years. "Hiroto, the spirit of the samurai is not just about wielding a sword or following a code of honor," he said. "It is the ability to uphold your principles and beliefs, despite any changes around you. It is the ability to adapt without losing yourself. You must be like bamboo, flexible but strong. Never forget your roots, but be ready to grow in new conditions." Hiroto listened attentively, and determination to follow his teacher's words shone in his eyes. "I will remember your words, teacher," he replied quietly. Time passed, and Katsuro watched as Hiroto and the other students grew, learned, and became new defenders of tradition, preserving and developing it. Each of them was part of a great chain linking the past and the future. When Katsuro, now elderly and wise, watched the sunset over Kyoto, he felt deep satisfaction. His mission was complete. He knew that his era had passed, but its spirit continued to live in the hearts of new generations. And so, although the sunset of the samurai had come, their legacy continued to live, merging into the new world they had helped to create. The end. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to hit the like button. Thank you for your attention.